Do you think Square Enix released Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on a leap day, so technically its first accurate birthday will actually be pretty close to the release of the final part of this trilogy? Final Fantasy VII Rebirth released exclusively for the PlayStation 5 on February 29th, 2024 to high critical acclaim. The game is currently sitting at a 92 on OpenCritic, with 97% of critics recommending the game. The game was nominated for Game of the Year at the Game Awards 2024. It went on to receive many Game of the Year awards from several outlets, including Game Rant's Community Voted Award, and for what it's worth, yours truly. 1 year later, what is the read on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth? How do folks feel about its ending? How has it fared launching on PC? And most importantly, did the game put Square Enix in a position where Part 3 can cement this as one of the most remarkable projects in video game history? This is your warning. Spoilers are on the table for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and the entire compilation of FF7 while we're at it. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth had the weight of the planet on its shoulders when it launched. Not only did it need to follow up Remake's ambitious ending, continue the storied legacy of the name Final Fantasy VII, and be a good game on its own, it also had to win over the folks who weren't so happy with how Final Fantasy VII Remake's more meta-narrative aspects carried that game's conversation and acclaim. With a long list of needs and boxes this massive RPG had to check, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a title that almost feels like a miracle game. When compared to recent AAA Final Fantasy adventures like Final Fantasy XV and Final Fantasy XVI, VII Rebirth feels like a cohesive, complete vision that lives up to the series' rich legacy, despite technically being a portion of a full game. Rebirth did something 15 attempted and 16 didn't even bother with. It created a fully explorable overworld, which transitioned quite impressively to an expansive open world by late game. Spiritually, the open overworld of the original PlayStation-era Final Fantasy games was brought back to life for a modern audience. The planet was painstakingly crafted and crammed full of activities, from treasure hunts to Fall Guys obstacle courses, providing players hundreds of hours of things to do. Maybe the best example of this is just how addicted every single person who played this game got to Queen's Blood. I like a good card game in a video game. It's fun to imagine the rules and subculture of a TCG in a video game world. But the way Queen's Blood is integrated into the main story and side stories makes that aspect stand out as something special. Not many games are dedicated to fleshing out that in-universe addiction authentically, the way that in our reality, people just can't stop cracking Pokemon packs and battling in TCG Pocket or playing Magic. Queen's Blood has become so beloved amongst fans that more often than not, if you ask a Rebirth player their overall thoughts on the game, it likely won't take more than a few sentences for them to say something along the lines of, I wish Square Enix would just release a standalone version of Queen's Blood. Willingly asking for a game that could easily be monetized like there's no tomorrow. That's how you know you've got an incredible in-game side activity on your hands. So on this level of feeling content complete, the game delivered a new generation Final Fantasy title unlike any other for fans to lose themselves in wholeheartedly. This, paired with impressive character progression with a party relationship system that bleeds into team-based synergy attacks in combat, in one of the most refined action RPG combat systems you can play today, it all amounted to serious conversations amongst fans that structurally, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth should be the blueprint for the overall series moving forward. But even with everything Rebirth seemingly did right, its ending is once again, like Remake, a point of controversy 1 year later. Those who wanted the story to remain unchanged from the original 1997 release, we're disappointed to see new visions of Cloud and Aerith, Cloud blocking Sephiroth's blade from plunging into our beloved party member, and a should-be-dead Aerith and Zack Fair participating in the final battle. Similarly, those who were hoping to see the first game's ambitious meta-narrative twists on fan expectations continue in Rebirth were largely left wanting as well. This new presentation of the ending, now being more ambiguous, at best seems to be giving players a new way to see Cloud's sanity slipping, because, like Cloud, the player does not really know what's real. On that level, impressive. But at worst, this ambiguous ending comes across as a cheap way out of making a definitive choice about what is exactly changing in this new storyline. 365 days later, I think back on my time with the game and what it was able to achieve and evoke in me while I was playing, and it really does feel remarkable that a Final Fantasy title is this high quality across the board and just so rich of an experience in every other way, but its ending and lack of risk-taking in a significant way made me and others feel like this project wasn't reaching for the stratosphere, at least the way we thought it would be after finishing Remake. Those criticisms in mind, myself and many others look at Final Fantasy VII Rebirth as their favorite game of 2024. So in 2025, what's the current state of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth? Square Enix, almost infamously, is known for their lofty sales expectations. If Square ships a game, your odds of reading the title did not live up to sales expectations a few weeks after launch are better than seeing Sephiroth in front of Raging Fire. Unsurprisingly though, it seems like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was another victim here. Remake was reported to have sold around 7 million copies across PS4, PS5, and PC, which is more than a lot of games can hope to achieve in their lifetime. Rebirth, on the other hand, well, approaching the 1-year anniversary mark, there's no exact reporting on total sales other than it didn't hit the numbers Square had hoped for. Rebirth actually has a disadvantage in releasing on a console that has a fraction of the install base that Remake was able to sell to, but it also has the handicap of being a narrative-heavy sequel to an already lengthy RPG, despite what the marketing for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was saying in the ramp-up to release. You actually couldn't start with Rebirth. You would be pretty lost. It's not a perfect metric, but looking at trophy completion data on the PlayStation 5, out of all of the people who own Final Fantasy VII Remake on PS5, roughly 60% of them made it to Chapter 3 and completed it. And about 35% beat the game's final chapter. Just how many of those players decided to just forget playing the rest of Remake and dive in on part 2 of this story? How many people with zero familiarity chose to start here? In selling a sequel to a fraction of the audience for the first game, it makes sense that it would sell worse. This looming concern about the game's sales has also directed fan conversation since the release of Rebirth and clouded what otherwise was a landmark and bar-setting release for the series in terms of quality. Does it make sense for Final Fantasy games to look crazy expensive moving forward? Should Final Fantasy games be this content-rich? Should Final Fantasy games be shorter? Should the next Final Fantasy ditch the numbers to be less intimidating? Does Final Fantasy XVII need to look like Dragon Quest or Kingdom Hearts? Would a remake of another Final Fantasy like Final Fantasy X or 9 do any better? All of these questions and more have lit a fire of discourse in the Final Fantasy community over the past year, and while it doesn't amount to much, the real interesting angle comes from official strategy out of Square Enix for the future of the company, and potentially this remake project. In May of 2024, Square Enix officially announced its intent to shift its strategy away from the timed exclusivity, as we have seen with every mainline Final Fantasy title since Final Fantasy VII Remake, and instead focus on a new path of multi-platform releases. You would imagine day-and-date releases on every available platform that Square can get a game released on will only help their expensive, beloved RPGs in the long run, as well as assure they continue to make sense investing in and making. While we have yet to see a new big title release under this new strategy, and the exclusivity for Part 3 is currently up in the air, as nobody but Square and PlayStation knows if Part 3 was already signed away to the Blue Brand when the initial deal was penned, we instead have seen formerly exclusive Final Fantasy titles hit PC, like Final Fantasy XVI in September of 2024, and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth very recently in January of 2025. The PC release for Rebirth, almost 1 year after its initial release, was met with a lot of high praise. It's become the best way to experience the game with visuals that can run laps around the PlayStation 5 Pro version. It includes a host of good features to tweak, unlike the remake PC port, and it's even Steam Deck verified. Pairing all of that with reports that the PC version had a stellar launch sales-wise, with nearly 3 times as many concurrent players on Steam as there were for Remake at its launch, all things considered, it seems like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth still has a bright future ahead of it. In becoming Steam Deck verified, also, it's got a whole lot of folks expecting that both the Remake and Rebirth will be released on Nintendo Switch 2 as a part of this new multi-platform strategy. And surely the games would do well there, since Nintendo seems to be the go-to platform for RPG fans these days. The momentum of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, sales-wise, is looking to be a slow and steady situation, where this game in all its glory will be able to reach multiple audiences who haven't had a good experience with Final Fantasy in quite a while, so maybe this blueprint for the future that fans see in Rebirth will be able to act as a bit of an ambassador on non-PlayStation platforms to help find new fans and grow the audience of Final Fantasy. But a lot has to go right for all of that to happen, including a successful release in the third and final part of this Final Fantasy VII Remake project. So looking ahead after a year, how has Final Fantasy VII Rebirth set the stage for this grand finale? As of right now, the expectation for Final Fantasy VII Re-Part 3 is that it's going to be a massive generation-defining game. It also needs to translate the original game's cataclysmic final disc to a full RPG-sized adventure. A Tifa-led globe-trotting sequence, the reveal of Cloud's true nature, his rehabilitation, the weapons being unleashed upon the world, the return to Midgar, and a final confrontation with Sephiroth. All of that feels like it can easily pad out another Rebirth-sized adventure. But just how long is it going to take to see this thing through? Well, the great thing about the next chapter of the story of Final Fantasy VII for fans is that the majority of what's left takes place in locations already handcrafted by the team at Square that the party visited during Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Of course, there's still Mideel, Northern Crater, and it seems like Wutai is going to be an even bigger player this time around. As you watch this video, Square is currently crafting all of that, but so much of the story happens back in Midgar and familiar locations we've already visited. So the groundwork of combat, the majority of the world map, key locations, and now the storyline has been mapped out, with the team stating that they're pleased with the roadmap they have ahead of them. Pair all of that with word that Part 3 is choosing to stick with Unreal Engine 4 rather than shifting to the seemingly hit-or-miss Unreal Engine 5, and presumably the development of Final Fantasy VII Re-Part 3 should go as smooth, if not smoother, than the roughly 3.5-year turnaround that Rebirth saw from start to shipment. So what's left? What is there after Final Fantasy Rebirth that Part 3 will really need to wrestle with in its development, if not the open world or combat? Once again, the main hurdle seems like it's going to be fan expectations. After just how beloved Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has been by the wider Final Fantasy community, in terms of viewing it as an example to follow for future entries in this historically industry-pushing franchise, pound for pound, when you go looking for what represents what should be included with a $70 next-gen AAA video game, one of the few titles that will live up to those metrics is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Following that up will be no easy task. Square has already nailed the fundamentals, but with Part 3, they need to live up to a fluid and nebulous expectation teed up by Rebirth. They need to put a bow on that very controversial ending, this whole trilogy, and in a way, the legacy of Final Fantasy VII. With comments about working in a revised, happier ending for the party and speculation that Part 3 will be aiming to release in 2027 for the game's 30th anniversary, fans, post-Rebirth, are now expecting the world, and expecting to not have to wait very long to get it. The wild thing is, it feels achievable after Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, especially if the game's own development time is anything to go by. It's almost easy to see and believe in what the conclusion of the series will look like and feel like, and where we'll all be able to play it. After the last year of all this speculation, hype, theorizing, and pure joy brought by a game with Final Fantasy VII in the title, as it was in the time after Final Fantasy VII Remake, a heavy burden has been placed on the shoulders of this next game in the saga. If Rebirth is anything to go on, those who enjoy Final Fantasy will be in for a treat when this conclusion hits, even if it can't attain all of its lofty ambitions. So what do you think about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth over the last year? Does this game in particular excite you about the future of the Final Fantasy series? Do you want Final Fantasy XVII to be a brand new adventure in the style of this game's combat and exploration? Or are you just not a fan of the latest take on this legendary series? Be sure to let us know. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, you can stay tuned to Game Rant for more videos like this.